Gabe? Gabe, it's your mother. You should come out.
I live in the UK with my dog, and for context, it's important to note that there's a huge expanse of woods behind the house I live in. Early last month, this thing that looks and sounds exactly like me began to show itself directly to me, but I fear it's actually been around for much, much longer. About 4 years ago, my parents, grandmother, and cousins were over at mine for a get-together. I remember my mom leaving to go smoke around the back. Not even a minute later, after going out, she came back all flustered and asked me why I was outside in the woods. She said I was staring at her blankly. The thing is, I wasn't. I was inside with my grandmother and dad. My mom passed it off as just seeing things. Stupidly, so did I. Cut to last year. I was in my lounge when my dog ran off into the conservatory, barking like mad. This wasn't really surprising as we do have quite a few rabbits and other vermin around the area. That was till, I kid you not, I heard my voice talking, in the conservatory. I checked outside. Nothing at all. Last month while cleaning the kitchen, I saw me again, outside in the woods. It looked identical to me. This thing didn't move an inch. It was like a statue. I froze in place. I guess it was more the shock of seeing myself with my own 2 eyes, physically. I leapt over to the conservatory door. Gone. It was gone. In the split time it took me to go to the door, this thing was gone. Last Saturday, I was upstairs on a work assignment when I heard my voice asking to be let in. My dog was going nuts and got worse when this thing was clawing and scratching at my windows and door. I contacted the police, and I'm away at my parents' house for the time being. I don't know what to tell people or if they'll even believe me. I just want this to end. Any advice? Because I'm dreading when I see this thing again, or what it'll do to me. I can only assume what my mom and I encountered was a doppelganger. For context, my dad used to work at night. Anyways, when I was around 6 or 7, I lived in a townhouse with my mom and dad, up until my mom passed away less than a couple months later, and she was pouring me some milk in the kitchen like every other night. There was nothing scary about this night, and I was just waiting for my mom to finish pouring the milk. While I was blankly staring off into space, I noticed my dad had appeared in front of a closet door in our living room. It didn't scare me at first since I just assumed it was my dad, but looking back, there was no noise to indicate he had come home. Our doors and floors creaked, and with how quiet it was, we would have heard anyone moving around. It wasn't scary at first since I was still under the impression that this was my dad, but the longer he kept standing there and staring at me, the scarier it got. He didn't move an inch, didn't blink, and the longer I kept looking at him, I noticed his eyes were too small. They were wide open, but small enough to know where it looked wrong. I remember I started to blink and rub my eyes, because I thought maybe I was seeing things, but it just kept standing there for a good minute longer, until after one of my many blinks, it disappeared. No noise at all. There was no way, considering it had disappeared in a blink, for it to have humanly moved that fast without making some kind of sound. The only way it could have disappeared as fast as it did was if it slammed the door shut behind it. I remember how terrified I was at that point, and looking to my mom to see if she saw it too. But when she didn't say anything, I assumed I just hallucinated it for years. That was until a few years ago, when I was telling my dad about that night, and he told me my mom had also seen it. But due to her mental health problems and me not saying anything to her or him about it, he dismissed it as a hallucination as well. Nothing quite like that has ever happened to me again, but that experience was the reason for years I couldn't sleep without a light on. Before that day I was not afraid of the dark. I didn't believe in ghosts, and wasn't really religious either. Every night after that incident until we moved, I was petrified to even sleep in my room. This story is from a childhood friend who had told me this, and it still unnerves me to this day. She was genuinely freaked out, and her family even backed up her claims, so here it goes. Basically, my friend and her family moved into this rental property, which my friend said was haunted. It gave everyone an off feeling. Those who visited or stayed over would mention it. I, myself, experienced this odd feeling of foreboding whenever I went over there, and I, too, started to believe in the consensus that the house was haunted. It honestly felt oppressive in the house, and you would feel this pitiful dread that is hard to compute into words, and was extremely uncomfortable to experience, to say the least. Anyway, this particular explicable event, which is the basis of this story, was enough for my friend's family to pack up and stay with relatives until they moved out permanently. On this fateful afternoon, my friend had arrived home from the park and heard an argument taking place in the kitchen between her mom and dad. My friend thought this was odd, as both of her parents should be at work, so she called out to them before unlocking the front door and going inside. My friend said the house fell instantly silent, an uncanny silence like all the air had been sucked out of the place and felt stifling and wrong. Then her mom said, "Hey, we are just in here." My friend was just outside the closed kitchen door at this point and froze beyond opening. It was her mother's voice, but there was something off. It sounded flat and unnatural. My friend decided to bolt back out the front door and waited outside until her brother came home. But she said as she turned back to the house, she saw her mother peering at her from the lounge room window. But it wasn't her mother. The face was the same, everything was the same, but her face was devoid of anything that made it her mother. There was no recognition on her mother's face. There was no indication that she was looking directly at her daughter, and there was no emotion in the expression. Nothing. The eyes looked utterly blank. My friend screamed and ran down the street to her mother's work and confirmed that she was there all this time. Initially, my friend's mother reasoned that someone must broke in, but a later investigation proved nothing had been stolen, and the back door was locked, as was the front door. No one could rationalize what my friend saw in the window and why it looked so much like her mother. So that was the deciding factor to get the hell out of there and find somewhere else to live. The landlord of the house denied anything like this happening when they lived there, but did admit tenants didn't stay long, saying there was quote-unquote something wrong in the house. My friend also told me she was the only one who saw anything definitely sinister in the house, but her family said they definitely felt an evil presence there, which manifested into the experience my friend had. Around 15 years ago, when both of my kids were toddlers, I was putting them into bed one night, and my son was adamant that he would wear his favorite red race car pajamas. I happily obliged, helped him change into them, and tucked him into bed. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a friend who had come over to chat and catch up. The way that my apartment was set up, you could see my kid's bedroom doorway from the kitchen table. My friend and I were talking for a while, before we were suddenly interrupted by the sound of my son screaming. We both turned and looked at the bedroom doorway, and saw my son standing there loudly crying/shrieking, and wearing his green pajamas with airplanes on them. Everything inside me was screaming that this was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver shot down my spine. My friend and I stared at each other in utter disbelief. We both knew that my son couldn't change his pajamas by himself yet. We looked back at the doorway, and my son was gone. We ran to the bedroom and found him tucked in bed, still sleeping peacefully in his red race car pajamas. My friend had asked me if I saw him standing there in his green airplane pajamas, and I confirmed that I had. Rightfully, my friend freaked out and left. I slept on my kids' bedroom floor that night to make sure nothing happened to them. My friend and I still don't talk about it to this day. We stayed in this extremely old, creepy cabin in Montana. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it was so old that you didn't even have a bathroom, just an outhouse. There was a rope that went from the cabin to the outhouse, so you could navigate back and forth at night, because it was pitch black. The cabin was super unsettling and had some strange details about it. The strangest thing that there was this really tall bed in the upstairs loft, where you had to climb stairs to get on the bed, and under the bed was this child-sized door that was locked from the outside. So one night my mom was dead asleep when she wakes up out of the blue feeling really afraid. She opens her eyes to see my stepdad just staring at her with freakishly wide eyes and a scary grin. And she said he just looked horrifying. He said, "How are you feeling?" This makes sense because the first day we got there, she got really sick and stayed that way the entire trip. As soon as he muttered this, she heard footsteps approaching. When she looked to see who was coming up the stairs, it was none other than my stepdad. He had gone to use the outhouse and was confused when she told him what had happened. She turned back to see who was in bed with her, but nobody was there. It scared the shit out of her, and we left the next morning. She also felt better within hours of getting on the road. About 5 years ago, my newlywed wife and I were having an early morning fight. It was the type of petty, childish fight where we were not talking and acting like if the other one didn't exist. We both had to go to the pharmacy, but she was just moving way too slowly, so I left the house and I started walking by myself. When I was about a minute away from the pharmacy, I was listening to some YouTube video on headphones and staring at the ground. Out of my peripheral vision, I see the obvious clothing and shape of a female. When we're about to pass, I lock eye contact with my wife, but it wasn't her. This being had her exact face, but with a permanent evil scowl, and those eyes bore right through my soul when we stared at each other. I was taken aback and at a loss for words, so I just kept walking. I turned around after I felt safe enough to do it, and even from behind it looked exactly like my wife. I managed to get my things at the store, walk the short walk home, and see my wife getting dressed. And I asked her just to make sure, "Were you just at the pharmacy?" She says in a smart tone, "No, don't you see I'm getting dressed?" The clothes she's changing out of were not the clothes I saw her wearing, nor were the ones she was putting on. The experience pops in my head on occasion, and my mind tries to rationalize what happened, or what it could mean. When I was in high school, the parties I would go to were just bonfires with way too many kids there to fit us all sitting around one small fire pit. So naturally, being teenagers, the focus would always quickly shift away from the fire itself and to God knows what other stupid teenager stuff. Often, back in grade school, that meant breaking into someone's parents' alcohol stash, ding-dong ditching, TPing some poor neighbor's house, or wandering the neighborhood up to no good, or sometimes all of the above. There was one time my friends and I were invited over to a small party at this girl's house. Let's call her S. The ironic thing about this particular bonfire was that it was extraordinarily tame. Most of our time was spent with all of us sitting around the fire and joking around. Us boys, being boys, would point out every little noise we had heard coming from the forest and ham it all up, saying we heard voices or twigs breaking or saw shadows moving amongst the trees, just to scare the girls. They ended up moving their chairs so their backs no longer faced the forest. However, there were a few times later on in the night where I wasn't making it up, and I actually did hear or see something weird in the woods, like a creepy voice or some shadows disappearing behind tree trunks. I didn't think much of it though. I mostly dismissed it as paranoia, so I just played it off and carried on with the jokes and theatrics. Later on, the whole group got up, and we were wandering around the neighborhood for some reason I can't remember. But once we were done with whatever we were doing, we headed back to the fire pit. As soon as we sat back down, however, my friend A realized he had lost his phone and figured he must have dropped it in the grass somewhere while we were walking around. So a portion of us stood back up and went to scour the neighborhood for A's phone. We eventually found the phone, after maybe half an hour of searching, but almost at the same time, we noticed that one of us was missing. My other friend, B, who had been with the search party, was nowhere to be found. So we continued searching, only now it was for our missing friend instead of a phone. But we couldn't find him. We searched the entire neighborhood, yelling his name and texting and calling him, but all to no avail. We eventually made our way back to the bonfire to regroup with the rest of our friends and enlist their help. When we got back to S's house, however, there he was, our missing friend B, just sitting there in a lawn chair with a sour look on his face. "What the hell, A?" B demanded. "Where did you go?" Confused, A snapped back at him. "What do you mean? You're the one who disappeared. We've been looking all over for you." As best as I can recall, this is what B told us. He had split away from the group to cover more ground looking for A's phone, when he heard someone whisper, "Psst," from over by the edge of the woods. When B turned to look, he saw A, motioning for B to follow him into the woods with a smirk on his face, and a finger on his lips. Now, A and B like to play a lot of jump scare pranks on us, so this wouldn't have seemed overly strange or creepy, and B did in fact follow him into the woods. This is the part of the story where my memory gets a little hazy. In a nutshell, B lost track of A while sneaking through the woods, and so he waited, quietly looking around for a bit before one of the girls either caught a glimpse of him or heard him walking in the shadows and freaked out. B then gave up, emerging from the woods to calm our friend down and to ask if anyone had seen A, eventually taking a seat by the fire pit to wait for our return. The thing is, A had been with the rest of us the whole time, searching for his phone, and I myself can attest to that. Everyone else had been accounted for, either as part of the search party or sitting by the fire the whole time. But B swore up and down that he had followed A into the trees, or at least someone who looked exactly like A. The moon was fairly bright that night, and B said he had gotten close enough and had just enough light that he could clearly tell it was A, hunched over just outside the tree line, beckoning him to follow. And we spent the rest of the night inside S's basement. Someone even mentioned the idea of calling the police to tell them that there was a strange man trying to lure kids into the woods, but B was so adamant that who he had seen was either A or some creepy carbon copy of A. And we believed him, so we figured it wasn't any use calling the cops if it was a supernatural thing in origin. We never got any answers as to who or what it was B had followed into the woods that night, and we could never figure out why that person or thing lured him into the dark forest just to vanish without a sound and let B return to his friends. We've all kind of fallen out of contact over the 5 years since graduating high school, but whenever I do see my friends, that night always comes up in conversation.